If someone had told me that one day I would be grateful for having been betrayed, I would have thought it was madness, because back then, I believed there was nothing worse than seeing the man you love choose someone else. I thought that was the greatest misfortune that could happen to a woman. And maybe it really is, at least at first, when your heart still does not understand what has happened. But time has a curious way of turning everything upside down, of transforming wounds into strength, of making us look back and realize that what seemed like the end was only the beginning of another story. Before I start, please like this video and subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love knowing that my story is reaching different places. My name is Lourdes, and I have lived through many things that today show themselves in my white hair and in the lines on my face, but none of them taught me as much as that betrayal. It was what forced me to look at myself in a way I never had. It was what pulled me out of the comfort of believing that my worth came from a man's love. It was what showed me that when everything falls apart, we discover a courage we never knew we had. Back then, I was a simple woman, like so many others. I would wake before the first light of day to prepare the coffee and put the house in order. My whole life fit inside the small rooms of our home, where I thought happiness lived. I took pride in every detail. In the floor, I scrubbed until it shone. In the plants, I tended in the yard. In the smell of bread that filled the air in the late afternoons. I thought that was what kept a marriage strong. The care, the devotion, the certainty that I was always there, ready to serve. Joaquim was a man of few words. He worked in the workshop on the other side of the village and came home always at the same hour, carrying his tiredness on his shoulders. I did not complain. Since I was a girl, I had been taught that men were just like that, quiet, too busy to bother with affection. And I accepted it, because deep down I believed he loved me in his own way. I did not need declarations. It was enough to know he came back home every night and ate my beans. That, for me, was proof enough of love. I do not know when things began to change. Maybe it was in the silences that grew longer, or in the absences that no longer had any explanation. The truth is, for a long time, I preferred not to see. I kept telling myself it was only a phase, that soon he would go back to being the way he was before. Because in those days, I was terrified of imagining my life without him. But fate does not ask if we are ready. It simply happens. And all at once, I found myself sitting on the edge of the bed, hugging my pillow, asking what I had done wrong. I asked myself why my love had not been enough. I cried softly so as not to wake our son and prayed to God that it was just a bad dream. But it was not. It was real. And it was then that I discovered how much pain can teach, because when everything falls down, there is nothing left but you and yourself. And that is where the truth lives. I had to lose what I loved most to realize that I existed beyond that marriage, that I had worth even alone, that I could be whole, even if he no longer wanted me. At first, it was hard to accept. I would wake in the night thinking there was still time to forgive, to pretend I did not know. I was afraid of what people would say, afraid of loneliness, afraid I would not be able to handle life without his company. But as the days passed, I began to understand that the shame was not mine, that the one who betrays is the one who should lower their head. I had only loved, and loving has never been a shame for anyone. I cannot say exactly when the resentment began to give way to something else. Perhaps it was the day I managed to sleep an entire night without crying, or when I noticed that I no longer waited for the sound of his steps coming home late. It was in that time that I began to see myself differently. The woman I had been was gone. In her place, another was born, more cautious, more self-possessed, stronger. That was when I understood that that betrayal, no matter how painful it had been, was also an opportunity. An opportunity to choose myself, to put myself first, to rediscover tastes I had forgotten. I went back to sewing, to humming softly in the kitchen, to tending my garden as if I were tending my own heart. And little by little, the sadness became a memory. Today, looking back, I see it was a blessing in disguise. Because if I had not been betrayed, I might have kept living a small life, lulled by the illusion that everything was fine. I would never have discovered that solitude can be peace when you learn to enjoy your own company. I would never have learned that nothing, not disappointment, not abandonment, can take our dignity from us. I tell this because I know many women, just like me, think betrayal is the end of the road. I thought that too. But today I know it is only a new beginning, and that often, the greatest gift life gives us is what we first believe to be the worst loss. So if you carry this pain in your heart, do not feel smaller. Do not think it is your fault. Do not accept the crumbs of someone who does not know how to see your worth. I am living proof that it is possible to turn betrayal into a blessing, that it is possible to start over even when everything seems lost. I am Lourdes, the woman who was betrayed and thought she would never endure it. But I am here, telling my story with peace in my heart, because I learned that the most important love is the one you learn to feel for yourself. If someone had asked me back then if I was happy, I would have answered yes without thinking twice. I believed that happiness was exactly what I had: a simple house, a hard-working husband, a healthy son, and a routine that never changed. I thought that this constancy was a blessing because I had seen many women suffer for not even having that. I always woke before the sun rose, when the sky was still pale and the hens began scratching around the yard. That early morning silence was my favorite moment. I liked to breathe in the smell of the coffee brewing, of the bread I kneaded patiently with my own hands. I was proud of my home, of every detail I had built myself: the smooth cement floor, the cotton curtains that swayed in the breeze, the wooden bench Joachim had made for us to sit on the porch. Everything had a story. Everything held meaning. Joachim was not a man given to affection, but I had grown used to that. When we were young, he would bring me wildflowers he picked by the roadside. After we married, those little gestures became rare. But he still came home every day, and I understood that for him, that was how he showed he cared. At first, I missed hearing sweet words, feeling that warmth of courtship. But with time, I convinced my heart that true love was made of routine, of presence, of commitment. I made a point of keeping everything in order. My trousseau was stored in the chest my mother gave me when I married. The towels I had embroidered with my initials were my pride. When a visitor came, I would brew fresh coffee and lay my best cloth on the table. I had the impression that if my house was clean and smelled good, no one would notice the small flaws in our marriage. My son was my treasure. Still little, he would run around the yard barefoot, inventing games with old cans and pieces of wood. When I looked at him, I felt that everything was worth it. I told myself he had a safe home and would never go through what I had as a child. My father drank too much, and my mother suffered in silence. I had promised I would never let my child live in fear. Maybe that was why I insisted so much on keeping up appearances. When anyone asked how things were, I would smile and say everything was peaceful, because most of the time, I believed it. I saw no reason to doubt my husband. He had always been a quiet man, coming home, eating, bathing, and going to bed. I saw in that routine a certainty, as if the fact that everything stayed the same was a guarantee that nothing would change. I remember one afternoon especially well, one of those that stay etched in your heart. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange. I was sitting on the porch, sewing a new dress for my boy. Joachim came home early, something that rarely happened, and sat beside me. He was quiet for a while, looking at the horizon. Then he put his arm around my shoulders and said I was a woman of courage, that he admired my strength. In that moment, my chest filled with joy. I saved those words like someone saves a jewel, because they were rare, and because deep down, I needed to hear that he saw me. At that time, I did not know that calm can be only an illusion. I never imagined that one day all of it would fall apart. When I closed my eyes to sleep, I thanked God for giving me such a proper life. I felt protected inside that routine, as if nothing could cross our walls. I had simple plans. I wanted to save a little money to buy a better sewing machine. I dreamed of fixing the roof that always leaked when the heavy rains came. Sometimes I thought that when our son grew up, he would be proud of the home we had built. I had no ambition for riches. I only wanted peace. I also had my fears, but they were small fears. Fear of becoming a widow too soon, of some illness taking my boy, of drought ruining our manioc crop. It never crossed my mind to be afraid of another woman. I never thought that betrayal could exist inside a marriage that, in my eyes, was honest, and that was why the pain took me by surprise. Because I believed, with the blind faith of someone who has never been betrayed, that love was enough. I thought my devotion was sufficient to keep everything together. I did not understand that a man's heart can grow weary, even when the woman does everything right. Today, when I remember that time, I feel tenderness and also sadness. tenderness because I was pure in my hope, sadness because that woman I was did not know life had other plans. But I do not judge that, lords. She did what she knew how to do, with the heart she had. I tell all this so you will understand where I came from. Before I became the woman who turned betrayal into a blessing, I was a devoted wife, a homemaker full of simple dreams. I was someone who believed that if I cared well for my house and my husband, nothing bad would ever reach us. I did not know that sometimes the storm comes anyway, that love is no shield against disloyalty, and that, in the end, the only thing that saves us is the courage to begin again. I often say that a woman's heart feels before her eyes can see. Mine felt it, but I did not want to listen. I preferred to believe that it was nothing but a fantasy in my head, because it was easier to go on pretending everything was fine than to admit that something had begun to slip away. The first sign was not big or scandalous. It was a small change that only someone who truly knows the other can notice. Joachim had always had the habit of coming home at the same hour. You could set your clock by the sound of his steps crossing the yard. But after a while, he began to be late. At first, he would say he had stayed at the workshop sorting out some accounts. Then he would claim that the boss had asked him to help carry some parts. I listened to it all and nodded my head, pretending to understand. But inside me, something stirred. A pang I did not know how to name. Another thing that changed was the way he looked at me. Before, even though he was quiet, he had a way of looking that belonged only to us. It was a look that said that, despite the tiredness, he saw me. With time, that look disappeared. He began to avoid my eyes, as if afraid to linger too long on my face. I noticed it, but I pretended I had not, because admitting it would be like lighting a lantern inside my fear. I remember one day when he came home with a different smell, a perfume I did not use, nor did I recognize. When I asked what it was, he said it must have been the soap at the workshop. I smiled and changed the subject, but I spent the rest of the night with that smell stuck in my memory. It was then that I understood that distrust grows slowly, like a weed, and if we do not pull it up by the roots, it takes over our whole heart. The silences also grew longer. Before, our dinners were quiet, but it was a peaceful quiet, each of us tired but at ease. Later, it turned into a heavy silence that made me want to invent conversation just to fill the emptiness. I would ask about his work, about the weather, about anything that would make him lift his eyes, but he would answer in short words and go back to staring at his plate, and I would smile, even when all I wanted was to cry. There was one night when I woke in the middle of the night and realized he was not in bed. I got up quietly and found him sitting on the porch, smoking. The glow of the cigarette barely lit his face. When I came closer, he quickly put out the cigarette and said he could not sleep. I sat down beside him and asked if everything was all right. He said yes, but he did not look into my eyes. In that moment, my heart understood what my mind kept refusing to accept. Even so, I went on making excuses. I told myself that every man went through phases, that after so many years together, it was normal for routine to weigh on him. I clung to these explanations, the way someone clings to a board in the middle of a river, because it was better to believe that than to think I was no longer enough. I started noticing that on Sundays, he took longer to come home. Before, he would return early, to have lunch with me and our son. Later, he only came when the sun was already setting, saying he had been to visit a friend. I did not have the courage to ask which friend that was. I was terrified of the answer. It was one afternoon like that when something happened I have never forgotten. I was sweeping the yard when I saw Joachim on the other side of the street, standing by Estella's gate. She was there too, wearing a light dress that fluttered in the wind. They were talking in low voices. I did not hear what they said, but I saw the way he looked at her. It was not any look. It was the same look he had once had for me. I felt my heart wither. I stood there, holding the broom, without knowing whether to shout, to cry, or to pretend I had seen nothing. That night, he came home and kissed me on the cheek as always, but I was no longer the same. Inside me, something had broken. I made dinner, set the table, and we pretended everything was like before, but it was not. I could not eat. I just sat there watching him chew, trying to guess if he was thinking about her. After that day, I began to notice every detail, the different smell, the hurried way he hid his eyes, the clothes he changed before coming home. I knew that at any moment everything would come to the surface, But even then, I stayed silent, because my fear of losing him was greater than my need to know. Today, when I think about those signs, I see they were all there, waving at me. I was the one who chose to close my eyes, and I do not blame myself for it. At that time, I believed that if I did not look, the pain would not exist. All I wanted was to preserve my home, my son, my life as I knew it. I did not know that ignoring the truth only makes it grow, until it becomes a giant you can no longer face. I think we always hope that the truth will arrive gently, as if asking permission. But in my case, it came without knocking, without asking if I was ready, without caring whether I could bear it. And I was not. It was an afternoon on a Thursday. I remember it well because every Thursday I made fresh bread to sell around the neighborhood. The smell would fill the whole house, and I felt proud knowing that my dough was everyone's favorite. I was in the kitchen, my hands covered in flour, when I heard someone knocking at the gate. I thought it was Dona Elvira, who always came for 2 warm loaves, but when I wiped my hands on my apron and went to see who it was, I found someone else. It was Dona Ritinha, who lived on the corner. A good woman, but not one to meddle in other people's lives. I thought it strange to see her there, her face serious and her eyes lowered. She held a cloth in her hands, twisting and squeezing it, as if she did not know where to begin. "Lords, forgive me for coming like this," she said without looking at me. "But I thought you needed to know." My heart leapt. I did not know what was coming, but I felt it would not be good. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "You can speak, Dona Ritinha." She sighed. She took a moment that felt like an eternity before she lifted her gaze. "I saw it, lords. I saw your Joaquim at Estella's house last night, and it wasn't just talking, my dear. Her voice faltered. I did not want to be the one to tell you this. For a second, everything around me went silent. The wind stopped, the smell of the bread disappeared, the birds fell quiet. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath with me. I felt the ground vanish under my feet. I grabbed the gatepost to keep from falling. I wanted to ask if she was sure. I wanted to say she must be mistaken. But deep down, I already knew. I just did not want to hear from someone else what my heart had been whispering for weeks. "I thought you had the right to know," she said softly. "Forgive me, lords." I nodded my head, unable to answer. I felt the tears rising, but I would not let them fall in front of her. I thanked her with a gesture and went back inside, walking slowly, as if I carried a stone in my chest. In the kitchen, I leaned against the table and closed my eyes. I saw my husband's face, the way he came home pretending everything was normal. I saw her light dress fluttering in the wind. I saw all the signs I had swept under the rug, and for the first time, I let the pain come all at once. I cried. I cried like a lost girl. I cried for everything that had been, and for everything I knew would never be again. I cried for the love I believed was safe, for the home that, in the end, was only an illusion. When the crying passed, there was only emptiness. A silence so vast it felt as if I had disappeared myself. I stood there, my hands still covered in flour, staring at the wall without seeing anything. I did not know what to do. I did not know if I should pack my things, if I should wait for him to come home to demand the truth. All I knew was that nothing would ever be the same. It took me a long time before I could move. I washed my face, cleaned the kitchen, as if the routine could save me from the shame. I thought of my son, playing in the yard, not knowing that his mother's world had ended that afternoon. I thought of my mother, who always said that no man was a guarantee of happiness. I had never believed her, until that day. When night came, I heard his steps approaching. My heart began to pound. I did not know how to face him. I did not know whether to scream, to cry, to pretend I knew nothing. But in the end, I did none of those things. When he came in, I was sitting at the table, holding a dishcloth in my hands. He greeted me as always. I lifted my eyes and looked into his face, searching for some sign of guilt. I saw nothing. He looked calm, almost content. And it was then I understood. To him, it was just another day. Only I carried the burden of knowing. I did not speak that night. I had no strength. I prepared supper in silence, watched him eat, watched him wash his face, and go lie down. I stayed alone in the kitchen, listening to the sound of the dishes, and thinking that this sound would always remind me of the day my world collapsed. When I finally lay down, I turned to the wall and cried quietly. But deep inside, a small part of me had started to be born, a part that, one day, would make me turn that betrayal into a blessing. I just did not know it yet. The next morning I woke with my chest so heavy it felt as if a weight were tied around my heart. It was still dark when I opened my eyes and realized that the life I had known was over. It was as if I had crossed a door that had no way back. I lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling of our house, the same house I had believed was strong as stone. Now it looked fragile, full of cracks I had never noticed. The sheet beside me was cold. Joachim had gotten up early, as if nothing had happened. I heard his steps going out to the yard, the sound of the faucet filling a bucket. Everything so ordinary, so unchanged, but nothing was the same anymore. I wanted to stay there, hidden from reality. But I got up because I was always the sort of woman who would not let the day defeat me. I washed at the sink, pinned up my hair, and went to the kitchen to make coffee. Every movement felt heavier than before. The spoon trembled in my hand. The smell of coffee made me nauseous. It was as if everything I loved had been dirtied by his lie. When Joachim came in, he did not say a word. He sat at the table, picked up his cup, and drank without looking at me. I stood there, a dishcloth in my hand, trying to imagine what story he would tell if I asked. But I did not ask. I did not yet have the courage. All I wanted was for him to leave me alone with my pain. When he went out, the silence took over the house. It was a silence different from any I had ever known. It was heavy, like mourning. I wandered from one room to the next, not knowing what to do. The emptiness seemed to grow with every step. The kitchen was clean, the floor swept, the stove spotless. But inside me, everything was chaos. I thought about going to Estella's house, about asking her everything I wanted to know, but I could not. My pride held me by the waist. I could not bear the idea of begging for explanations, of showing her she had managed to wound me. So I stayed there, closed up, chewing on my own silence. When my son came home from school, he ran to hug me. I nearly broke down. He knew nothing. For him, everything was the same. I forced myself to smile, to pretend that everything was fine, because a child does not deserve to carry the burden of adult sorrow. While I helped him with his lessons, I tried to think of something else, but it was impossible. The betrayal hovered around my thoughts like a crow. During that first week, I lived as if I were someone else. It was as if I were watching myself from the outside. I saw myself sweeping the yard, hanging out the clothes, seasoning the beans. But it was only my body that did everything. My soul had withdrawn to some dark corner where nothing could reach me. Sometimes I thought about packing my things and leaving. But where would I go? My mother was long gone, my brothers lived far away, and I did not have the courage to abandon my house, the story I had built with so much sacrifice. So I stayed. But staying did not mean forgiving. It was only fear. Fear of the unknown, of the emptiness, of loneliness. One day, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and stared at the street. The sun was shining on Estella's gate. I thought of her face, of the way she used to greet me as if she were my friend. And I felt a mixture of anger and pity. Pity, because only a very empty woman steals another's husband. And anger, because I had believed her. The nights were the worst. When everything grew dark, the silence became even larger. I would lie down and wait for Joachim to come home. Every minute felt like torture. When he came in, I pretended to be asleep. I did not want to talk, did not want to look at his face, but even without seeing him, I felt it. I felt her scent clinging to his skin, and that hurt me more than any word. I do not know how I managed to keep living in that house. I think it was instinct, because we are afraid to change, afraid to lose even the little that remains. So I clung to the small routines. I scrubbed the clothes harder, swept the yard until no leaves were left. It was as if, by cleaning everything on the outside, I might also clean the filth that had been left inside me. But it did no good. The emptiness did not leave. It lived with me, sat at the table, lay in the bed, drank coffee in the morning. It was my new companion. And as much as it hurt, I knew it would not go away anytime soon. There was a night when I sat on the edge of the bed and felt my chest could not bear it any longer. There was so much pain that it seemed my heart would stop beating right there, in the dark of that room that no longer belonged to me. I could hear the crickets singing outside and thought that if I disappeared, no one would even notice. In those days, I lost all taste for everything. The smell of food made me sick. Music irritated me. Even the birdsong seemed to mock my sorrow. I still woke early, as always, but it was only my body that got up. My soul stayed stretched out on the bed, too heavy to follow. I would look at my son and feel an even greater ache, because he was not to blame for anything. He was only a child who needed his mother whole. And I was not whole. I was cracked, broken into pieces so small I did not know if I could ever gather them again. One day I wanted to disappear. I thought about leaving without a note, without an explanation. I wanted to open the door and walk until I felt nothing anymore. But then I would remember my boy's little face and the way he hugged me, and that kept me here. It was for him that I stayed, because if it had depended only on me, I no longer had the strength. People say that time heals everything. I did not believe that, because each passing day hurt more. It was as if the wound, instead of closing, kept opening deeper. I remembered every detail: his scent, the way he would run his hand through my hair, the promises he made when we married. All of it turned into knives in my chest. I felt anger toward him, but I also felt anger toward myself. Anger for having believed so much, for having given all of myself, for thinking that love was enough to hold a marriage together. I asked myself what I had done wrong. If I had been prettier, more cheerful, more interesting, would he have stayed? Those questions haunted me in the small hours of the night when the silence grew even larger. I felt shame. Shame to go out and face the neighbors. Shame to look at Estella, to look at him. Shame for having been deceived so easily. I thought everyone must be talking, that everyone knew except me, and that was what killed me inside. Sundays were the worst. Before, they were the days when we would eat lunch together, laugh at our boys' stories, rest in the hammock in the afternoon. Afterwards, they became days of waiting. I would sit watching the gate, imagining where he was, with whom, what he was doing. Imagination is cruel. It invents details that may not even be true but hurt as if they were. Sometimes I wished he would confess everything once and for all, that he would come home and say, "I do not love you anymore." At least then I could stop pretending I did not know. But he kept acting as if nothing had happened. That was what wounded me the most, because it felt as though my pain did not matter, as if I were only another piece of furniture in the house, an old habit he did not have the courage to throw away. I had no one to confide in. My mother was gone, and I had few friends. And even if I had wanted to tell, I did not know how to put into words that shame. So I stayed silent. I kept everything inside my chest until it could hold no more. It was during that time that I started to talk to God in a different way. I no longer asked him to bring Joachim back. I only asked for strength, strength to wake up, strength to care for my son, strength not to go mad, because there were days when I thought I was losing my mind. I looked in the mirror and did not recognize myself. The shine in my eyes was gone, my mouth always pressed into a line of sorrow. I missed the woman I had been, the one who believed in love, who was proud of her family, who thought nothing could tear her home down. I did not know where she had gone. One night, I sat on the porch wrapped in a shawl and cried until my face hurt. I looked up at the sky and whispered that I could not take it anymore, that I did not know how to go on. And it was there that I thought my life had ended, that there was nothing left beyond the pain. But no matter how much it hurt, I was still there, breathing. And only much later did I understand that this was already a form of resistance. I had not disappeared. I had not given up. I was alive. And even if that was all, it was a beginning. I cannot exactly explain when it started. There was no marked day, no sudden revelation. It was a slow movement, almost imperceptible, like a seed sprouting under the earth where no one can see. But suddenly, I realized that even in the middle of my pain, there was something inside me that was not willing to die. Perhaps it happened on the day I woke before sunrise, and for the first time in a long while felt the urge to set the kettle on the fire. The steaming coffee seemed like a small gesture, but I knew it was more than that. It was a way of telling myself that I was still here, that despite everything, I was still standing. In those first days, every step cost me immense effort. I had to force myself to get out of bed, to comb my hair, to wash my face. I felt so tired that sometimes I wanted to lie down on the floor and stay there until time passed me by. But then I thought of my son, of his eyes watching me with that innocence that did not deserve to see me give up. and so I would take a deep breath and carry on. I began to realize that sadness had a cycle. It came strong, like a storm, knocking me down, drowning me. But later, it passed. Even if only for a few hours, I felt a small relief, as if I were raising my head above the water. And in those moments, I understood that perhaps there was a way out, that perhaps I did not have to live the rest of my life that way. It was on a cloudy afternoon that I felt that flame burn more strongly. I was sweeping the yard and found, leaning in the corner by the wall, a little pot of basil my son had planted. I had forgotten it was there. The leaves were wilted, the soil dry. I stood looking at that tiny plant, so small, so close to dying, and suddenly I cried. But it was not the crying of someone who wants to disappear. It was the crying of someone who remembers that she still cares. I ran to fetch water and moistened the soil carefully. I touched the little leaves and whispered an apology, as if it were possible to comfort that plant. It was then I realized that as long as I still cared about something, even if it was only a forgotten pot, I was not completely lost. From that day on, I started doing small things just for me. I washed my apron with care, put on a bit of perfume before bed, fixed my hair even if no one would see me. In the beginning, it all felt pointless. But little by little, I began to understand that these gestures were seeds of something bigger. They were my way of reminding myself that I still had worth. I also began talking to God differently. Before, I only asked Him to take the pain away. Now, I thanked Him for the days when I could get up, for the moments when my son laughed and I could laugh with him, for the courage that was growing slowly, quietly, but that was there. The neighbors noticed the change. One afternoon, Donna Elvira showed up at the door with a plate of fritters and said I had a different look on my face. I smiled. It was not that the pain had gone. It was still there, but it no longer filled every corner. I was beginning to understand that sadness did not have to define me. I was still afraid. I still had nights when emptiness sat at the edge of my bed, watching me, as if to remind me that I had been betrayed. But for the first time, I felt I was not completely at the mercy of pain. I could choose what to do with what remained of me. When Joaquim came home, I no longer rushed to pretend I was asleep. I looked into his eyes, even though it hurt, because I needed to remember that I existed, that I was not invisible. He could tell there was a difference. Sometimes he looked uncomfortable, but I said nothing. I still did not know what would become of us. I only knew that I no longer wanted to be the woman who crawled silently. There was a morning when I caught myself humming while ironing clothes. It was so natural that I only noticed it afterward. When I realized, I smiled to myself. It was proof that even wounded, my heart still knew how to invent joy. I did not fool myself into thinking everything would go back to the way it was. I knew that wound would leave a mark. But for the first time, that did not frighten me. I understood that scars also tell who we are, and that perhaps they could teach me something I still did not know. That was how I began to awaken. It was not quick, nor easy, but it was real, and deep down I knew that this small flame refusing to go out was my salvation. The first step to rebuilding myself was neither big nor beautiful. It was not like in the novels, where the betrayed woman wakes up suddenly, determined to become someone else. My first step was small, almost timid, but it was mine, and it was that step that saved me. I remember that morning, when I woke before everyone else. The sky was still dark, the cold winter air coming in through the crack in the window. For a few minutes, I lay there, feeling the weight of the silence all around me. I knew that if I wanted to, I could spend the whole day there, lying down, sinking into my sorrow. But something inside me asked me not to do that. I got up slowly, washed my face, and pinned my hair in a tight bun. I put on my cleanest apron, even if no one would notice. I needed to look whole, even if only for myself. That day, I decided to clean the house as I had not done in a long time. I opened all the windows, shook out the rugs, scrubbed the floor until my knees ached. As I scrubbed every corner, I thought that maybe, if I cleaned enough, I could erase the smell of his lies. It was a way of telling myself that this home could still be mine, even if he no longer was. When I finished, I sat on the porch, exhausted, but with a feeling I had not felt in a long time. I was proud that I had done something for myself, not for him. It was as if that cleaning was a new beginning, a message that I would not surrender so easily to sadness. In the days that followed, I continued with these small gestures. I started cooking recipes that I liked, and not only what he preferred. I put the radio he had forbidden me to play loudly back on the shelf, and I let the music fill the house. In the beginning, it felt as though I was committing some defiance, but later, I began to understand that I had the right to occupy that space in my own way. I also returned to sewing. For months, my sewing machine had been covered with a cloth, abandoned in a corner of the bedroom. One day, I lifted the fabric and ran my hand over the wood, feeling longing for the woman who used to sew dresses with joy. It was hard to sit down there again. It seemed that if I did, I would be admitting that life went on. But deep down, that was exactly what I needed to admit. The first thing I sewed was a new apron for myself. When I finished, I put it on and looked at myself in the mirror. It was not just a piece of cloth. It was a silent declaration that I still existed, that despite the abandonment, I had not disappeared. The neighbors noticed. Some came to ask how I was doing, and I answered that I was getting better. It was not a lie, but it was not the whole truth either. The pain still kept me company. There were still nights when I cried softly, hidden from everything. But during the day, little by little, I could remember who I had been before everything fell apart. I also began to spend more time out in the yard. Before, I felt ashamed to be seen, afraid of gossip, but I started to understand that the shame was not mine. I had not done anything wrong. I was not guilty for loving. So I began to tend the plants, to speak to people passing by on the street. It was hard, but every time I lifted my head and greeted someone, I felt a small triumph. The greatest step, though, was when I decided to put my bedroom in order. For a long time, that room had become a place of pain. The bed that had once been my refuge had become a witness to the lies. But I knew that if I really wanted to move forward, I needed to transform that space. One Sunday morning, I opened the window wide and stripped off the old sheets. I washed the blankets, swept the floor, changed the curtains. In the end, I set a vase of flowers on the nightstand. I looked at that room, so clean, so mine. For the first time in a long while, I felt I could sleep there without shame. It was that day I understood that rebuilding does not mean erasing the past. It is learning to live with it without letting it define you. I knew I still had much to face, that my heart would still hurt for a long time, but I also knew that each small step brought me closer to the woman I wanted to be again. And in that silence that used to crush me, I began to hear something else. A whisper that told me that even broken, I had worth, that even betrayed, I was still worthy of peace. It took me a long time to understand that the pain he caused me was not only ruin. For a long while, I saw that betrayal as the worst thing that could have happened to me. And perhaps it was, in the way it forced me to look at myself without any illusions. But it was also, without my realizing it, a hidden blessing, wrapped in the ugly paper of disappointment. At first, I only saw the dark side. I thought about all the time I had wasted, about the dreams that would never come true, about the promises he had thrown away as if they were torn scraps. I looked at the mirror and felt anger toward the woman I had been. So devoted, so blind, so sure that love was enough. I blamed myself for having been foolish, for trusting too much, for believing that fidelity was the rule and not the exception. But as the months went by, something began to change. It was as if my sadness were a burnt field, and little by little, small green shoots began to sprout. I realized there were things that only that pain could teach me, and that, if I had not gone through all of it, perhaps I would never have discovered who I truly was. It was during that time that I started to do things I had never dared before. I began walking alone along the road that led to Señor Vicente's little store. Before, I only ever went with someone, out of habit or fear. But now I liked to feel my own footsteps, to know that I could get wherever I wanted without needing anyone. It was a new freedom, half frightening, half good. I also began to say no. For years, I swallowed my words to avoid arguments. If Joaquim wanted something, I would say yes, even if it went against my own will. If someone disrespected me, I stayed silent. But after that wound, I discovered that I had a voice, that I could speak, and that I would no longer accept less than I deserved. One afternoon, I was sitting sewing when I realized that I no longer felt that knot of anxiety in my stomach, waiting for him to arrive. Before, it was as though I needed his presence to know who I was. Now, I was enough. I was the owner of my house, of my time, of my thoughts. And that, simple as it may seem, was an enormous victory. I know many people believe that only those with company are truly happy, that a woman alone is an incomplete woman. I myself thought that way for a long time. But it became clear that solitude can be less cruel than sharing a roof with someone who belittles you, that being alone, sometimes, is the price of peace. I also came to understand that not every love has to last forever to have value. What I lived with him had beautiful moments, memories I still keep. But when it ended, it left room for another kind of love to be born. The love I learned to have for myself, the respect I had lost and found again. If I had not been betrayed, I would not have met this version of myself. Perhaps I would have gone on living in lukewarmness, believing that erasing myself was natural. Perhaps I would never have tasted the flavor of freedom, the dignity of making choices on my own. That is why, when I say it was a blessing, it is not because I romanticize pain. There is nothing beautiful about being deceived, but there is something powerful in surviving, in picking up the pieces of your heart and building a new home from them. I did not turn to stone. I simply discovered that I was stronger than I had imagined, and that strength today is what I am most proud of, because no one gave it to me. I had to dig for it inside myself, in the darkest place, to find it. It was the hardest and most precious gift life ever gave me. I never imagined there would come a day when my heart would be capable of feeling gratitude for all of it. For a long time, I thought that story had left only scars and pain. But there was a moment, just an ordinary day, when I realized that wound had also been the beginning of a new life. It was an ordinary morning, like so many others. I had woken early, made coffee, and tidied up the house. The sun was coming in through the window, lighting up my apron hanging over the chair. I sat in the kitchen, the warm cup between my hands, and stayed there, watching the steam rise. That was when I felt a different kind of calm, a peace I had never known. In that instant, I realized I no longer felt anger. The pain still lived in me, but it had changed its shape. It was no longer a pain that consumed me. It was a memory, like a scar one learns to accept, and along with it came an understanding I never thought I would have. I was alive. I had been through all of it, and somehow I had come out more whole. It was then that, for the first time, I gave thanks. I did not give thanks because he had lied, nor because she had betrayed me, but because I had survived, because I had discovered I could walk on my own 2 feet. I gave thanks because if none of it had happened, I might still have been that woman who believed her worth depended on a man's gaze. I remembered the lords I had been before, the one who lived only for others, who was afraid to speak her feelings, who thought she had to earn love like someone earns a prize. I felt tenderness for her, because I knew she did the best she could, but I also knew I did not want to be that woman anymore. That day, I looked around and noticed my home had changed, not only because I had changed curtains or painted walls, but because the silence that lived there was no longer the heavy silence of hidden secrets. It was my silence, a silence of peace. I felt proud that I had stayed, that I had not destroyed myself, proud that I had gotten out of bed on the days when it seemed impossible. I understood that courage is not never feeling afraid. Courage is carrying on even when fear feels bigger than you. As I drank my coffee, I thought of all the women who had been betrayed. I thought of how we learned to blame ourselves, to shrink ourselves. And I thought that if I could, I would tell each one of them that pain does not have to be the end, that sometimes it is only the beginning of another life, more honest. I did not know what would become of my future. I did not know if I would ever love another man. But in that moment, I realized that was no longer so important. I had discovered that my worth did not depend on anyone. I was whole. I was enough. And with that certainty, I took a deep breath and gave thanks. I gave thanks for the woman I had been, for the woman I had become, and for the woman I would yet be. I understood that betrayal had shown me something I might never have learned any other way, that my life belongs to me, that my dignity can never be stolen. That morning, for the first time, I felt I was free. I always heard it said that peace was something that came from the outside, that we could only feel at peace when everything was fine, when life was going the right way. But after everything I lived through, I discovered that peace is not a gift someone gives us. It is a seed we ourselves must plant and water every day. It was after that day when I gave thanks for having survived that I began to look for this peace. It was not easy. There were still mornings when I woke with my heart tight, remembering what had been and what would never be again. There were still afternoons when I asked myself whether it would have been different if I had made another choice, spoken another word, been another woman. But little by little, those questions began to lose their strength. I realized that life does not go backward. It only goes on. I began to find peace in the simplest things, in the smell of fresh coffee, in the sound of the wind tapping the window, in the light of evening that painted the wall golden. These were things that had always been there, but I had never seen them, too busy trying to please and prove my worth. When I started to look around with more attentive eyes, I discovered that life still had small gentlenesses to offer me. I also found peace inside the silence. In the beginning, silence frightened me. It seemed an emptiness full of echoes, where only my sorrows fit. But over time, I learned to listen to that silence, and I discovered it was not my enemy. It was a space where I could hear myself without hurry, where I could remember who I had been before everything. I started to take better care of myself, not out of vanity, but because I understood that my body was my home, and I needed to treat it with respect. I went back to rubbing cream on my hands, combing my hair patiently, putting on clothes that made me feel beautiful, even if no one would notice. Every small gesture was a way of telling myself that I deserved tenderness, even if it did not come from others. One day, I sat on the edge of the bed and realized I no longer felt that fear of going to sleep and waking up to the same nightmare. My heart was tired but calm. I knew I did not have to prove anything to anyone anymore. Not to Joachim, not to the neighbors, not even to myself. I only needed to be who I was, with my pains and my courage. I also learned to forgive. Not because they deserved my forgiveness, but because I deserved to rest. Resentment is a chain that keeps us tied to what has already passed, and I no longer wanted to live chained to what had no remedy. When I understood this, it felt as though a great weight lifted off my shoulders. There was a day when Estella walked down the street and lowered her eyes when she saw me. For the first time, I did not feel anger or shame. I only felt pity. Pity for someone who does not know how to build her own path and has to destroy someone else's. I walked on without shrinking. In that moment, I knew I was free. Peace also came when I understood that solitude is not punishment. It is time life gives us to reorganize the soul. I learned to enjoy my own company, to feel complete with only myself and my son. I realized I did not need another love to validate me. I was enough. It was in that clean silence, without lies, that my heart found rest. I did not forget what had happened, but I learned to leave the memory where it belonged, in the past. I am not the story he tried to impose on me. I am what I chose to become after everything fell apart. And it was like this, without hurry and without noise, that I found peace inside myself. If today I decided to tell all of this, it is not so that anyone will pity me. I am no poor creature. I am a woman who lived her whole story, with its loves and its sorrows, and who learned that no disappointment has the strength to kill who we truly are. I write these words because I know that somewhere there may be another woman reading them with a heavy heart, going through the same sadness that once was mine. I wish I could sit beside you, hold your hand and say, "You are not alone." When everything happened, I felt small, ashamed, as though it were all my fault. I thought I should have done more, loved more, taken better care of myself. But today I understand that the one who deceives is the one who must carry the weight of deception, and the one who was betrayed carries only the pain, which is not a punishment. It is proof that we truly trusted. If I could leave you with one piece of advice, it would be this: do not apologize for having loved. Love is the most beautiful thing in life, and if someone did not know how to honor yours, it is not you who should feel ashamed. I want you to know that the heart, even when it breaks, can learn to beat in a different way. I know this because it happened to me. I thought my end had come, that there was nothing left, but inside me, there was a small flame, and it was that flame that made me get up every day. That flame lives inside every woman. Sometimes we think it has gone out, but all it takes is a breath of courage for it to come alight again. And so, slowly, I rebuilt my life, without hurry, without promising it would never hurt again, Because the truth is, it still hurts now and then. But now the pain does not define me. It only reminds me who I was and who I chose to become afterward. I also learned that solitude does not need to be feared. It can be a quiet friend that teaches us to enjoy our own company. It was in solitude that I found again the lords I had lost, the woman who dreamed, who sang, who believed in better days. If one day you feel empty, remember that your story is not over. Betrayal is not the last page. It is only a part of the plot, and you can write the next lines with the ink of your courage. Today, when I look at my home, I do not see only bad memories. I see everything I built with work and affection. I see my son growing up with the values I taught him. I see every small detail that survived the lie. And that is why I say, no one has the power to take from us what we planted with truth. I do not know where Joachim is now. I no longer hold resentment. I only wish he found what he was searching for. I do not wish harm on anyone, because carrying resentment weighs more than any betrayal. And I have learned to live light. I know I am not perfect. I carry my scars, my weaknesses, my regrets, but I also carry a strength I never knew I had, and it is that strength I wish to leave behind as my memory. If today you are crying, I understand. If you are afraid, I understand. But please, do not believe that this defines who you are. You are so much more than the pain. You are everything that will still bloom. My greatest legacy is not the story of betrayal. It is the story of what happened afterward, the quiet restart, the choice to live, even when it seemed impossible. And this is what I leave for you, the certainty that there is always a way back to yourself, that no lie, no abandonment, no contempt can erase your dignity. I am Lourdes, a woman like so many others, a woman who was betrayed and who, even so, learned to give thanks, a woman who discovered that the greatest victory is not having a perfect life. It is having the courage to be whole, no matter what happens. If you liked Grandma's story, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you can hear more stories like this and share them with other people who might be inspired by this story of overcoming. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been in a similar situation? How did you react? A kiss on the heart from all of you, and until the next story.